We talk about the Kaminoans, the architects of the Grand Army of the Republic, a whole lot on this channel. They really put the clone in Clone Wars after all, and without them, the CIS would have steamrolled the Republic. But as we've discussed in many past videos, the Kaminoans weren't the nicest of folk. They were brutal eugenicists, ruthless toward their creations and indeed toward other species in general, which they saw as inferior. But while we're certainly not here to defend the Kaminoans, there are reasons why their culture developed the way it did. In this video, we're going to be taking another look at the Kaminoans and how their species got a particularly nasty lot.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Kamino, the Kaminoan homeworld, was located outside the galaxy itself, suspended between the galaxy and companion Orek, a satellite galaxy otherwise known as the Rishi Maze. It was about as obscure as a planet could be, astrographically speaking. Its star was pretty much drifting out on its own on the edge of the Rishi Maze, not really part of any larger galaxy. As a result, the Kaminoans had a rare chance to evolve and take to the stars without making contact with any other sentient species. This was a blessing and a curse, however, as it also meant the Kaminoans were on their own when catastrophe struck. The planet the Kaminoans evolved on was a far cry from the Kamino we're familiar with. It had a number of different climates, ranging from shallow oceans to icy tundras to sprawling grass plains. The Kaminoans built their first cities in Kamino's lowlands, building first with stone and then with metal, constructing many great shrines and monuments over the years. Kaminoan civilization thrived as technology began to advance, and it seemed to the Kaminoans like their people had a bright future. Then came the Great Flood. Kaminoan civilization developed during a prolonged ice age, and in 19,000 BBY, that ice age came to an end. The climate of Kamino changed drastically, perhaps due to Kaminoan industrial activity, and as a result, all of the planet's glaciers and ice caps melted. The atmosphere became much more turbulent, so that torrential thunderstorms were the norm on Kamino. The oceans rose until the only land that was left were a few scattered islands, the remains of what used to be mighty mountain peaks. When the Great Flood began, the Kaminoans knew they were screwed, and they knew that drastic measures would have to be taken to ensure their species' survival. They turned to science, pouring their energy into researching genetic engineering and the art of cloning, which they hoped to use to preserve both Kamino's native animal species and themselves. As their old cities drowned, they built new stilted ones that would be safe from the rising oceans, and started to move there en masse. Before long, the new stilt cities were the only habitable places left on the entire planet. This quickly became a problem. The Kaminoans were low on resources and their population was much too large to support itself. They had managed to preserve many of Kamino's non-sentient species through cloning, but cloning was a time-consuming process, and time was something that Kaminoans didn't have. This was how the Kaminoans became eugenicists. They tore apart their species' genome, deciding which traits were desirable for the species' long-term survival and which weren't. Those with desirable traits were given preferential treatment, while those with undesirable traits were pretty much left out to dry, or soak, rather. It took the Kaminoans thousands of years to move past the challenge of the Great Flood, but eventually, their society did stabilize again. They emerged from the disaster a changed people, however. Genetics became the centerpiece of their society, culture, and even religious ideals. They became rigid perfectionists, especially when it came to themselves and the species they were cloning. Gone were the days when the Kaminoans would build great monuments in the valleys of their homeworld. After the flood, even their architecture became clinical and cold. Even Topoka City, the greatest and wealthiest of the Kaminoan stilt cities, was minimalistic in design, like one massive laboratory. Before long, Kaminoan genetic engineering stopped being a matter of survival and started being an endless quest for genetic perfection. They euthanized any members of their species with unusual genetic traits, such as green eyes, and started experimenting on themselves to create individuals with specific beneficial traits. One Kaminoan, Kina-ha, was genetically modified to be able to live for much longer than most members of her species. She ended up living for over 3,000 years. Genetic traits determined Kaminoans' social status, with eye color becoming the determiner for the emerging castes of Kaminoan society. Kaminoans with blue eyes became laborers, Kaminoans with yellow eyes handled skilled work, and Kaminoans with grey eyes served as administrators. Genetic perfection became an almost religious concept for the Kaminoans. They believed they represented the pinnacle of life, able to rise above even the calamitous Great Flood and still thrive, but they always sought to improve upon their species even further anyway. They feared and hated genetic imperfections within their own species, some more than others. The most extreme members of Kaminoan society, the Kaminoan ascetics, took this to an obsessive level, shunning other, less perfect Kaminoans, and routinely euthanizing clones they produced that weren't completely perfect according to their standards. Some curious aspects of the Kaminoans' original society endured, however. They had a ritual dance called the Nara, which involved public displays of emotion, something the Kaminoans otherwise frowned upon. Additionally, after the Kaminoan clone laboratories began to breed creatures capable of carrying them to the seafloor, many Kaminoans made pilgrimages to the ruins of the Deram city, the largest of Kamino's old cities. There, they would look around the ruins, contemplating existence and reflecting on their lives and the survival of their species. Cloning, naturally, was an essential part of the Kaminoans' new way of life. It was their main source of food and other animal resources, and as a result, the Kaminoans became quite good at it. Their cloning methods differed greatly from the clones that were developed simultaneously in the galaxy at large. Their quest for genetic perfection led them to approach the cloning process slowly and carefully, valuing quality in their products far more than quantity. They rarely sped up the development of their clones by more than 50%, a rarity in the outside galaxy, and they often took the time to properly socialize their creations as well. It's unknown when visitors from the greater galaxy made first contact with Kamino. It could have been as early as 15,000 BBY or as late as 4,000 BBY. What is known is contact between the Kaminoans and the rest of the universe was sparse right up until the start of the Clone Wars. This was mostly for two reasons. The first, of course, was that Kamino was remote and only a handful of beings in the Republic knew where it was. The second, however, was that the Kaminoans were tremendously xenophobic. They saw all other species as inferior, especially those that didn't constantly strive toward genetic perfection. Of course, in the interest of avoiding problems, they generally kept this perspective to themselves when dealing with outsiders, who only ever saw the icy, clinical facades the Kaminoans hid behind for most of their waking lives. Despite their disdain for other species, the Kaminoans eventually started making clones for off-worlders, albeit for hefty sums of money. Their products included everything from armies of cloned berserkers to slaves intended to be worked to death in the mines of Subterul. Generally, the Kaminoans cared little for the fates of their products. They were more interested in the process of creating a successful clone. The ethical implications of creating living beings to sell as slaves didn't really occur to them. They had been cloning for so long that they had lost the idea that treating sentience as property was wrong, if they ever had it in the first place. Kamino's proper introduction to the galaxy at large came in 22 BBY, when the Kaminoan made Grand Army of the Republic descended on Geonosis, sparking the Clone Wars. By that point, Kaminoan society had been rather stable and consistent for millennia, kept at a nice, even population of about 1 billion. But while the Kaminoans had overcome the hardships of the original Great Flood, the effects the Flood had on their culture persisted. They made their own lives hellish with their ruthless perfectionism, and they coldly persecuted any Kaminoan with genetic oddities. They treated each other horribly, and all things considered, it really should be no wonder that they were just as terrible toward their clones. After all, if these self-obsessed perfectionists didn't even treat members of their own species with dignity, Could they really be expected to extend that courtesy to others? So that's why the lives of the Kaminoans sucked. But what do you think? Are there other species you'd like us to look at the history and culture of? Feel free to let us know in the comment section below. And just before you run off, guys, if you're interested in high quality weekly videos of badasses from all different eras of history, make sure you check out our new channel called The Braved, where once again we post high quality weekly videos to satisfy that history itch of yours. First link in the description below. And if you just want to jam out to some music, check us out on our Relax Jack music channel. A lot of the music on there we use in the videos here, so make sure you check them out. And if you want access to some exclusive content and an exclusive behind the scenes Discord where you can chat to myself and the team who make these videos and other patrons there as well, then check out our Patreon link in the description below. And if you just want to join the wider community, check us out on our Discord and our up and coming new Geetsly's gaming network. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.